Hey, it is breaking the news plus, and the clock is ticking on the people you elected to do the work for you. The legislature's got about 6 days left, and that means everything's got to get done by then. Danny Spewak is at the Capitol in the basement where he will live until about midnight on Sunday. Hi, Danny.
Hey, Jana. I did go out for a walk, so it is. I can confirm that it's sunny outside. I can't be in this basement for that long. You got to at least get out once, It's like.
It's bad for the Capitol reporters, probably worse for the lawmakers that they don't go outside during the real peak spring moments when they're trying to decide the fate of our state. But that's just the way it is. We don't set the calendar. So what are the big ticket items left for them to hash out?
I would say the biggest thing is probably the hospital funding is, when it comes to HCMC and then support for rural hospitals and just healthcare in general. I think that's one of the negotiations that's probably going to go down to the wire. We know there's some urgency with HCMC, obviously, because they say they could close by the summer. So that would have huge state consequences. And there's bipartisan interest in getting it done. It's just a matter of what does it look like. One of the main proposals to help them stay afloat is to repurpose a sales tax in Hennepin County. So there's different versions of how high should the tax be raised and what should the cost be to people in Hennepin County when they're paying for consumer goods, to help the hospitals. So those details are being hashed out right now. And then there's also the issue of this bonding bill, which is the infrastructure bill across the state. They did one last year. They're trying to do one again this year. And so that's always hung up in negotiations. So those are kind of the two big ones. And then there's a lot of other fraud measures, I think, that have a good chance of passing. We saw the Inspector General that passed. And then just some smaller items as well that despite a lot of the stuff you hear about nothing getting done, they are getting some stuff done. It's just not some of the big ticket items like on guns and immigration. There's just the parties don't see eye to eye. So that's not getting done. But there are other things that they do agree on.
Yeah, we'll get to that. I want to do one follow-up question just with the hospitals. You're talking about HCMC, and then you also mentioned the rural hospital angle to that. That's significant for all of the state of Minnesota. Are you hearing bipartisan agreement on helping them out on that one as well?
Yeah, there's some money that's being potentially tossed around, like stabilization funding that would go to HCMC and then also other hospitals as well that would include rural. There's a really complicated, sort of interesting debate, if you're really nerdy like we are, about a federal program that gives drug discounts. And it's like too confusing to even explain here that I'm trying to do for a story, but it's just it's a lot. Anyway, basically, there's bipartisan support for this program that basically helps hospitals make revenue off of drug discounts. There's a lot of lobbying going on each side. It's just a matter of whether that will come up for a vote in the House, and that's one way to potentially help some revenue with the rural hospitals. So there's various proposals being tossed around, and I think they may get something done. Just depends on what it looks like.
So let's move on to the ones that you mentioned that have really, they are just completely divided over party lines. And again, for everybody that's if they watch this, they probably already know the facts. There's a bit of a math issue at the legislature. You got a completely tied House, and then you got a very narrowly controlled DFL Senate. And so when things divide along party lines, it looks close, but it's party lines of clock. So let's talk first about Operation Metro Surge and ICE funding. I know the Senate yesterday said yes, but they're controlled by the Democrats to unmasking agents and getting a few more things passed. Will the House even hear that bill?
It is very unlikely to come to the floor. The Senate bill that passed narrowly this week was a collection of like 6 or 7 different items on like the unmasking of agents, making it easier to sue federal agents for constitutional violations, limiting access of ICE to schools and courts and hospitals. It was like 7 different bills all into one. So the Senate passed it. All of those bills were heard in House committees at various times this year. They'd come up in like public safety or education or any of the committees where they were relevant, and they all ended in tie votes. So they didn't advance. Republicans were against them, and they didn't make it to the floor. So kind of like you saw with the gun violence, there's not the support from the GOP, which holds equal influence in the House and has influence over what comes to the floor, obviously with Speaker Lisa Demuth. And so they haven't been supportive of those measures, and doesn't appear that it would have any path to law this year.
And that brings us to what you just mentioned, school safety legislation. The Senate passed the legislation that would put a ban on assault type weapons, high capacity magazines, but there's other stuff in there too for mental health and for several school safety measures that passed the Senate. But is it ever going to see the light of day in the House?
Yeah, we saw last week where after the Senate passed it, it goes to the House. But House leaders from the DFL were asking the leadership and Republicans in the House, like, where's the bill? And one of the representatives said that he'd been instructed not to report the bill because the Senate version just won't come to the House floor. And again, that's because the gun violence and a lot of the assault weapon bans and things, they already were debated in House committees and they were defeated. Republicans made their argument. They believe that banning assault weapons would be ineffective. They say it would be unconstitutional, as these laws have been caught up in litigation in a lot of different states. So they don't support that as a solution. The two parties do agree on some school safety and mental health funding that was in the Senate bill. Actually, Senate Republicans authored an amendment that would have just kept that in the bill and then stripped everything else out. If there's the will to do it, there actually is a lot of stuff around, like setting up anonymous reporting lines at schools. If if a kid sees something that's scary that could lead to violence, or like more mental health initiatives, like those things I think could pass. It just depends on if the two parties can get in a room and decide that they want to pass it. And for Democrats, they'd have to live with not getting any gun restrictions on that. And that's a decision that they'd probably have to make.
Yeah. It's a big political decision to make, obviously, because it's such a high interest. We're not talking about these things in a vacuum. The parents of the children that were killed at Annunciation have been at the Capitol. The kids that were hurt have been at the Capitol. They have met with lawmakers in the Republican Party trying to get them to sign on to this. So it's personal.
Yeah, and it's been interesting following this from the beginning, because this has been, the Annunciation shooting and then Metro Surge, and then the lawmaker shootings. Those have really cast a shadow over everything the legislature has done this year, and specifically on the guns. The Annunciation families have been very visible at the Capitol. They've held rallies. There are certain days you can't run into the Capitol without seeing someone who's, whether they're a child. I mean, in some cases, it's the Moisky family, and of course Fletcher's family as well, that have been very active in being there. You'll see them; they're visible. And then other parents who had kids that survived it, or even the kids themselves, have been here. And House Republicans have had to deal with that, as they've been told by the Annunciation families clearly what is being asked for with the assault weapons ban. And the House Republicans, and you talk to like Floor Leader Harry Niska, talking about how tragic he sees this as an issue. Speaker Damath has talked a lot about her experience of the school shooting that that her family endured, about 2003 up in the St. Cloud area. It's very personal for them too, just a fundamental difference in how they approach the issue. And they've made that they've articulated that. Leader Niska was telling me that they just don't see the solution the same, that they believe so strongly what the families are saying, but it's just a fundamental disagreement. And it's just something that the legislature really can't get past unless there's an election that changes the dynamics of it this year.
Yeah, that changes the math of the legislature. You talked about, and my goodness, I guess that speaks to the year that it's been, that I didn't even mention the assassination of Mark and Melissa Hortman in talking about gun violence. But that killing, and then the attempted assassination of John Hoffman, his wife Yvette, their daughter Hope, was just weighing on each lawmaker. And you can't walk into the House without seeing Melissa's empty desk and gavel and a memoriam to her. And the idea was that it would remind members that their language matters. Have you seen over the totality of this legislative session that people are understanding that the way that they talk matters?
That's a really good question. It's one that I've thought about as well. And a lot of times when I've been interviewing lawmakers, I've actually asked them that exact question of, like, has it changed? Has the tone changed? And at times I think so. And I do think behind the scenes, I do think that there is more of a recognition that these are human beings behind the party name. And so I think that always existed to an extent, but I think in some ways it has brought a lot of them closer together. And there is a lot of bipartisan work being done right now at the legislature on fraud. There's some really big fraud bills that are getting done with bipartisan support. But I do think that the climate is still, while there's a recognition of how awful the rhetoric has been sometimes nationally, I do still think there's an incentive for both parties right now to play to their base. And you see that with a lot of the social media stuff, and I'm not being necessarily critical of them for that. It's just the climate we live in. There's still, when you watch floor debates, much of it is directed less to each other and more towards the people that are watching them at home or watching the social media clips. And a lot of it is about electoral strategy, putting things on the floor to make the other side take tough votes. And that's just an election year. So I don't think that's changed. And that's always been part of politics. Again, not saying that that either party isn't doing anything wrong. It's just the system that we live in. But it is a tough question that you ask.
And my final question for you, Danny, as this session ends probably on Sunday night, the Speaker of the House, Lisa Demuth, is going to transition into a bit of a different kind of summer and fall. She is running for governor. She could get the nomination from her party. We haven't really, and this is kind of the same for the Democratic side too with Amy Klobuchar, we haven't really seen them campaign as much as we've watched these women work. And I get the sense that the fight between them will just really start this summer, but their resumes are their resumes because they're actively working in their roles. That's their campaign, not just telling you things, showing you what they're doing.
Yeah, and it's actually a really interesting dynamic on the Republican side because there's some, obviously it's going to be a tough battle for the endorsement later this month at the convention. And Speaker Demuth kind of positions herself as the leader of the Republicans. She's the top elected Republican in Minnesota. She is the House Speaker. She's visible. She's the one that got the budget done with Democrats last year. So she's really kind of painted herself as like the top Republican and the person that can lead the state. But one of her top challengers, Kendall Qualls, who nearly got the endorsement to 4 years ago, he's really like, I'm the outsider. And I think that there's an element of the party that's like, we need someone not that's in the middle of negotiating with Democrats. We need, an outsider. And I think that's what it's going to come down to, what the party wants. And, obviously there's other candidates in the mix as well. So the speaker's had to kind of, continue to do her job, but also, probably undeniably is thinking about, her, what the endorsement means and kind of what happens if she gets the nomination. It's only natural if she's running for the position. But in her public statements, I haven't noticed a huge difference in terms of what she said this year versus what she said last year.
Right.
When you're talking to her, on what they call the scrums after the Capitol sessions, you don't notice a lot of like electoral politics, but it's kind of baked into everything.
Interesting stuff. And so has Speaker Demuth said she would abide by the endorsement, or will she stay in the race if she's not endorsed?
The last that I heard when she made the announcement, and obviously this could have changed, was that I think that she had somewhat left the door open to a primary, but that was several months ago, so I can't say what her current position is. That's obviously a big thing for Republicans. Will you just drop it if you don't get the endorsement, or will you go for a primary? So that remains to be seen. Initially, she had sort of left the door open to potentially running in a primary if she didn't get the endorsement, but again, that was several months ago. So.
Well, it's less than 6 months away. So as this legislative door closes on the session, the election door opens for you just minutes after, Danny Spewak. So you can come out of the basement and talk elections come Monday. Well, you know what? Take Monday off. Come Tuesday.
There we go. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks for joining us tonight, Danny. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Janet.
That's all for this political legislative version of Breaking the News. I'll see you next time. Take care.